gang, Dan from Creepy Creations, and yes, we are starting our build on our gravedigger. So here's what he's going to look like. Okay, so how do you put that bad boy together? Well, obviously, wiper motor. And everything a gravedigger needs, of course, is a shovel. So we're going to start with the base and the shovel.
The first thing we'll do for the base is cut this piece of black wood that I had lying around to about 18 inches long. That'll give us good front to back stability.
Ta-da!
I found an old 2x4 which will also cut into two 18-inch pieces. This will give the base good side-to-side stability, and I'll screw it onto the bottom of the base.
Of course, every gravedigger needs a shovel. The one we've got here, unfortunately, the handle is a little longer than we like because the skellies aren't really full size. They're, I know, a little bit shy. They're only about 5.5 feet. So what we do is nip that off and try and round the end off a little bit, just to keep the handle a little bit shorter. And besides, we really don't need this kind of fancy, grippy end on it anyways.
A quick trip to the bench and a quick jab with the saw, and that shovel is cut down to size. Work some work with a file, and we've got the end rounded off close enough so it looks like the proper end of a shovel handle. Next, I'll mark off where the hinge is supposed to go. It's got to line up really close to the bottom so that the shovel appears to be touching the ground, but still allow the hinge to move freely. After fastening it securely with 3 bolts, the hinge isn't going to move anywhere. And now when I attach it to the base, the shovel is free to move forward and backwards as far as I need.
So you can see that the base only takes 18 inches square space, so it's not a huge storage problem. And our shovel is now free to move, so when we mount the skeleton, we'll slide it with one leg on the ground and another leg on top as if he's trying to dig in with the shovel. Everything is free to move, including the skeleton's arm. Next step, put on a windshield wiper motor mount and hook up a linkage to the wiper motor so that we can make the shovel actually move with a power supply.
One last touch on the shovel is to use a green Sharpie to color in the tops of the bolts. While it's not a perfect match, it at least takes some of the shine off. Before mounting anything, I'm going to take a little time to solder the wires from the motor onto the wires from the power supply so that they don't come loose. One thing to consider with the power supply is how to mount it. Fortunately, most power supplies have this little slot in the bottom that would normally slide over a bolt in the PC. We'll put a screw in the wood and use it to hold it down, and a little angle bracket on the end so that the power supply doesn't slide forward and off the screw. The mounting bracket for the motor is a little more complicated. I'll need to take this aluminum and bend it in a loop over the motor so that it fits the shape, then bend it out flat so I can screw it onto the wood. Once I've got it made and drilled some holes in it, I'll put it over the motor and screw it into place. I can use a little shimmy of wood underneath to tighten things up if I need to, just in case the loop doesn't match up perfectly. And And finally, a quick test with the power supply to make sure the motor doesn't bind and the crank turns freely. Now we'll put that screw into the wood so we can mount that pesky power supply. And we'll put a little angle bracket on the end so it won't slide forward and come off the screw. We'll do one last test with the power supply, just to ensure we haven't shaken anything loose or knocked any connections off. Nope, looks good. Now here's the tricky part. Figure out how long your linkage has to be and how you're going to mount it. Don't forget, I've got the motor set at basically what's going to be the furthest extension out, but the distance between the end of this mount here on the motor and my mount point on the shovel is always going to be the same. So if I want that out about that far, I make a linkage about like that, but as the motor turns around, it's going to go back to here. That actually looks about right. Now that we've figured out how long the linkage has to be, we'll drill a hole in the side of the shovel where we can install a bolt. This is the shovel side of the link connection. In order to attach the linkage to the crank on the motor, I'll first put a bolt through the linkage and then attach one nut on the back, adjusting it so there's just enough space for the linkage to move freely. I'll then put a second nut on the back of it and tighten the two together so that they lock in place. I can then insert this through the crank and the motor and use a third nut tightened on the back to hold the whole thing in place. That way, the bolt will swing freely with the crank, but the linkage will rotate around it because of the space we've allowed it. We'll repeat the same process, attaching the other end of the linkage to the shovel. Again, we'll use a bolt and two nuts on the back to hold the linkage space, and then a third nut to hold the bolt in place on the shovel. Now the moment of truth. So apply the power and voila! We have our shovel action. That's looking pretty darn good. So it's time for a little skeleton reconstruction here. We've got our skelly all ready to go, except that he's one of those pose and stay skeletons. Most of the time that's actually a benefit, and we do need that function for some of his bones. However, for the arm, and particularly the hand and the one leg, we actually have to slacken up the little mechanisms here that they use to hold the skeleton position. And most importantly, we're going to take his hand off there, and I'm going to try and build the hand around the shape of the shovel handle so that it looks like he's actually holding on to it. So that's our next step. Fortunately, the hand is easy to pull out because there's just a single screw that you can undo with a screwdriver and it pops right out. So that's pretty easy to deal with. So let's see what we can do with that hand. It turns out a butane barbecue lighter generates a decent amount of heat to soften up the plastic on the fingers. It does scorch it a little bit, but the soot comes off pretty easily, so it doesn't leave too big a mess. And after a little bit of experimentation, we finally get the fingers bent in a decent enough shape that it looks like he's actually gripping the handle. One last thing I'm going to do is, because the hand doesn't actually rotate at the wrist, it tilts up and down, I'm actually going to put another hole through the wrist here so that when I put the screw in, the wrist will stay angled sideways rather than trying to go flat, because most of the skeletons, the hands go flat like that, so I want it
So put that through there, that should take care of that problem. And now that we have that all straightened out, we can, or actually not straightened out, haha, curved. We will remove the screw that I just put back in so I don't lose it. And we will slide the hand back into the wrist. Pop our little screw right through the old hole that we drilled there. Just screw it back into place. And voila, the gripping hand.
My next challenge was to mount the skeleton in such a way that it looks like he's holding onto the shovel with his bent hand, and he has one foot perched on the edge. I bought this metal tubing, which I'll use as a stand, and I'll drill a hole in the base that the tubing will slide into to act as a support. Before I drill the hole, I'm going to mount an extra piece of wood on. That'll give me some extra depth and provide additional stability for the rod.
Yar, in case there's a gale blowing. Hurry, 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 hurry.
With the rod inserted into the hole, now I can actually attempt to mount the skeleton. I'll just use some wire ties to hold it against the rod, as that's going to be enough to hold it in place. The skeleton's not too heavy. I'll mount the hand up there, and eventually I'll use a small wire tie to hold it in place permanently.
That's basically the gist of it. And then hopefully when we fire this bad boy up, I'll get his hand attached. And we'll have to loosen that arm up a lot. But you get the idea. Working the midnight shift here. Pretty close.
One downside with pose and stay skeletons is, what do you do if you don't want him to pose and stay? Well, it takes a little bit of plastic surgery where we actually have to loosen up the mechanism that holds the arms in place. This involves disassembling the arm so that you can actually remove it from the shoulder. Inside we find the mechanism that actually holds the arm in position when you move it. We're going to remove the springs from it so that it doesn't actually close the teeth together that act as the holding part. This should allow the arm to swing freely. Once we've loosened the mechanism up, we can reattach the arm. You'll notice that with the springs removed, the teeth don't want to clamp together, so that the arm is clear to swing as freely as it likes. The mechanism inside the elbow is virtually identical, except that there's teeth on both sides. So instead of one big spring, there's two smaller springs on either side. Once those are removed, the elbow itself is free to move too.
So we now have his arm nicely limbered up. So we'll move with the shovel, no problem. And we're hanging onto the springs that we took out just in case we ever need to put it back and restore it to full pose and stay readiness.
Even creepy juniors come out to check out the inaugural run.
Wait, that's not my dad.
Anyway, here's the finished product. Thanks for watching. Stay safe. Have fun.